The story of the Great Depression begins in a time of glitter and confidence, when the 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties. America was booming, cities grew taller, factories ran faster, and Wall Street seemed unstoppable. The nation was emerging from the shadows of World War I, standing as the world's leading industrial power. Jazz music filled the air, cars rolled off assembly lines, and stock prices climbed higher and higher. To many, it felt as though prosperity would never end. The rich flaunted their wealth, while the middle class dreamed of joining them, investing what little they had in the stock market, convinced that it could only go up. In this atmosphere of optimism, few could imagine the storm that was about to change everything. By the mid-1920s, the stock market became the heartbeat of American ambition. Millions of ordinary citizens began to invest, buying shares not with cash they had, but with borrowed money, a practice known as buying on margin. It was a dangerous game. People would borrow 90% of a stock's price, hoping to repay it with profits when the stock rose. As long as prices climbed, it seemed brilliant. But underneath this glittering economy, there were cracks no one wanted to see. The farmers who fed the nation were already struggling with low prices and heavy debts. Factories were producing more goods than people could buy. Wages were not keeping up with the cost of living, and income inequality grew sharply. America's wealth was concentrated in a small fraction of society, while millions barely managed to survive from paycheck to paycheck. Banks too were caught up in the frenzy. Small local banks lent recklessly, and big investment firms speculated wildly. The stock market became less about business and more about gambling. The illusion of endless prosperity made everyone believe that nothing could go wrong. President Calvin Coolidge famously said, "The business of America is business," reflecting the nation's faith in the free market. There were few government regulations, and Wall Street operated freely with little oversight. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates low, making it easier for people to borrow and speculate. Newspapers glorified the stock market's success stories, and Americans from all walks of life joined the rush, from factory workers to teachers to farmers. Then came the fateful year of 1929. The market had reached unprecedented heights. Stocks that once sold for $50 were now trading for $200 or more. People believed prices would continue to rise forever, but deep down, some experts were uneasy. The market was built on speculation rather than solid value. In early September 1929, warning signs began to appear. Stock prices became unstable, rising and falling dramatically. Nervous investors started selling off their shares, and panic slowly crept into the market. The first real shock came on October 24, a day that would later be remembered as Black Thursday. On that morning, as the 1930s began, the Great Depression tightened its grip on America like an unrelenting storm. By 1932, unemployment had reached nearly 25%. 1 out of every 4 American workers was jobless, and countless others were working only part-time for a fraction of their old wages. The once bright lights of cities like New York and Chicago dimmed as businesses shuttered and people lost hope. In rural towns, farms that had once symbolized independence now stood empty and foreclosed. The American landscape was changing, not only in its economy but in its spirit. Desperation became a daily companion for millions. The simple question of where the next meal would come from haunted families across the nation. In the industrial cities of the North, long lines formed outside soup kitchens run by churches and charities. Men in worn coats and women clutching children waited silently for a bowl of thin soup or a piece of bread. Former bankers, lawyers, and clerks stood shoulder to shoulder with factory workers and laborers. Pride gave way to survival. In the once thriving neighborhoods of Detroit and Pittsburgh, factories that had once roared with life were now silent. The assembly lines stopped, the machines covered in dust. The automobile industry, the symbol of American innovation, was nearly paralyzed. In the South, sharecroppers and tenant farmers lived in poverty so deep it seemed endless. Cotton prices fell to record lows, and what little they earned barely kept them alive. The Depression did not only destroy jobs, it shattered dreams. Young people who had once imagined a bright future found themselves stuck in uncertainty. College graduates stood in breadlines, their degrees worthless in an economy that offered no opportunity. Homelessness became a national crisis. Families built makeshift homes from cardboard, tin, and discarded wood in empty lots or under bridges. These grim settlements spread across the country, from New York to Los Angeles. People bitterly called them Hoovervilles, blaming President Herbert Hoover for failing to act decisively. Nearby, Hoover blankets, newspapers used to cover oneself at night, became a symbol of despair. The name itself captured the anger of a nation that felt abandoned. By 1932, America's frustration was boiling over. Protests erupted across the country. One of the most dramatic was the Bonus Army March in Washington, D.C. Thousands of World War I veterans, many of them unemployed, traveled to the Capitol demanding early payment of their service bonuses promised by Congress years earlier. They built camps on the outskirts of the city, hoping their government would listen. But instead of compassion, they met force. The U.S. Army, under General Douglas MacArthur, used tear gas and bayonets to clear the camps. Shocking images of veterans being attacked by their own government spread across newspapers, deepening public outrage. Hoover's reputation, already damaged, was destroyed. The incident began. By the late 1930s, the United States stood at a crossroads. The nation had endured nearly a decade of hardship that had tested its endurance, faith, and identity. Though the economy showed signs of recovery, scars of the Great Depression were still visible everywhere, in abandoned farms, shuttered factories, and the tired eyes of a generation that had known only struggle. The optimism that Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal had rekindled was real, but fragile. Millions still searched for work, and poverty remained widespread. Yet beneath the hardship, something profound had changed. The people had regained hope, and hope was the one thing that had seemed impossible during the early 1930s. The programs of the New Deal continued to expand and evolve. Government agencies employed artists, writers, and actors through the Works Progress Administration. Murals were painted in post offices, theaters reopened, and the dignity of creativity returned to American life. The Civilian Conservation Corps continued to replant forests and build parks, shaping landscapes that would be enjoyed for generations. Roosevelt's Social Security program began paying benefits to the elderly, ensuring that older Americans would never again be left helpless in times of economic collapse. In small towns, electricity reached homes for the first time through projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, transforming rural life. For many, these efforts were not just about economics, they were about rebuilding a sense of belonging and purpose. Yet, even as progress appeared, challenges remained. In 1937, the economy stumbled again. After several years of recovery, Roosevelt decided to cut back on government spending, hoping the private sector could now stand on its own. But the economy was still too weak. The sudden pullback triggered another downturn, known as the Roosevelt Recession. Factories slowed down once more, and unemployment rose sharply. Critics attacked the New Deal, calling it a failure, while Roosevelt supporters urged him to continue the programs that had brought relief to so many. The setback reminded everyone that the path to recovery was neither straight nor simple. The Depression was not something that could be erased overnight, it had reshaped the very foundation of the American economy. Even as domestic struggles continued, the world beyond America was sliding toward chaos. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, promising to restore his nation's pride after the humiliation of World War I. In Italy, Mussolini was marching toward conquest, and in Japan, militarists sought to expand their empire across Asia. The global economy remained unstable, and political tensions grew by the day. The Great Depression had not only devastated America, it had shaken the world order. Economic despair fueled extremism, and by the late 1930s, war clouds were gathering once again over Europe. In the United States, most people wanted to stay out of foreign co.